I was just thinking, and this is a sort of a follow-up to the previous video that I did about vegetable oils and stuff like that. And, sometimes we get into arguments with people, and it's always important to sort of go back and look at history, look at where we've come from, what people ate, what they did, and all that. And, you know, I've I've discussed before in some detail about the Great Depression, how that ushered in a lot of seed oils by that stage, because pretty much, so through the 30s and 40s, one, because it was easy to transport to the troops in the Second World War oils, animal fat's very hard to transport. So it was much easier to actually transport oils. And also you had the other situation where oils were, starting to become widespread in the 30s. And that's because of the Great Depression. People were much poorer. And so it was, it was a cheap alternative. It was propagandized and sold as healthy and all that sort of, clean and not didn't smell and shit like that. So there were a whole lot of angles that were pushed. There was the economic side. There was the food industry getting into all these different organizations and all that. So they were able to manipulate different bodies, different nutritional organizations and whatever else. And eventually even the Heart Foundation and stuff like that. So it was, these people used money, used influence, and used many other nefarious ways to basically promote these. Price point was very important. Had people really known the deleterious effects of these things, price point would have been irrelevant. I mean, even to this day, most people are completely unaware that the oils that their fries are cooked in, a lot of different meat products are cooked in, are pretty much, toxic, and so dangerous to their bodies, but they're completely unaware of and all that. A lot of people will go and say, well, if you take a look at, I mean, if we go back to the 1930s, there were probably about, in 1930, there was about 3,000, as I said earlier, about 3,000 heart attacks, from the mere one that was recorded a few years earlier. So by that stage, we'd had 2 decades of of seed oils in the food supply. It was still limited, it hadn't widespread. What really took place is where it dramatically jumped 500,000 by the 50s, and that really happened because you had the Great Depression, you had the war years where a lot of people went as soldiers overseas and all that. So over those 20 years, we had massive exposure to these oils and all that. But at the same time, a lot of in the 1950s, the food industry started emerging and all that. So that's where that 5 million, this is where at the time they started talking about, what's causing this? What are the diseases that, what is the causal thing? And, at the time there was, smoking could be it, people getting angry, and, there was a whole lot of non-food related causes that were out there. It was only much later on, when you got to the 60s and onwards, where you've got Ansel Keys, which basically puts forward his hypothesis. And by that stage, he's got a lot of influence because he created the K rations for the military. So he was connected to the food industry, to the military, to a whole of the political establishment. So he was able then to push his narrative far stronger than any other smaller player that was putting out a number of, including people who were saying that it was sugar, like Yudkin from the UK. So there were a number of other views out there, but pretty much seed oils was running under the radar, so to speak, being missed by many. And it was only much later on that, we started seeing research being done, especially when a lot of these crackpots were promoting seed oils and stuff like that as heart healthy compared to animal fats. And they started basically doing all those studies. Remember the studies that some of them even in Australia that were basically, filed away for 17 years, and other studies around the world that were actually, a lot of the data was hidden or, published in, obscure publications in order to minimize the potential damage, because these were clinical studies and they actually quite clearly showed the deleterious effects. You got the LA veteran study that showed quite clearly after 7 years. That's why you'll never see a study combine anything to do with seed oils more than 7 years, because it actually, or statins or anything like that. Why? Because that's when you start seeing a lot of, like with statins, cancer, with seed oils, you start seeing, strokes, cardiovascular disease, all these sort of things starting to build up and rise. And that's why they do all these short-term studies nowadays. They don't do these long-term studies because, there's too much blowback from those studies. Even though they're epidemiological studies, they still show strong statistical correlation between these sort of substances. And when they do clinical studies, follow-ups, which they did back then, it really showed how bad these things were. And that's why they got pretty much, we don't do them anymore. It's sort of all epidemiology sort of through the 80s onwards really took off, nutritional epidemiology, for the simple fact that, doing clinical stuff like they used to do in the 60s and 70s and whatever, and even in the early 80s, really sort of just put an absolute boot into their whole hypothesis, their bullshit. But just to give you a bit of a background about, that era, the 50s and all that, the post, the 40s, 50s, that sort of era that we're coming into, what was happening at the same time. So you had the introduction of the seed oils much earlier. Then you had the actual, the explosion of the fast food industry. This is a really important element because this is when we basically start seeing, the newfangled foods and all these sort of the processed food industry really starting to emerge. And many people think of the processed food industry 80s, 90s and onwards. It really started much earlier, but it wasn't as bad in the early days. But still, there was a lot of things that that were sort of the sign of the times. There's a really new fast food restaurants born in the 1950s. Taco Bell, Burger King are amongst the fast food chains that were started in the 1950s. With so many new innovations in technology and processing, the food industry was revolutionized in the 1950s. So all the new technology, all the new approaches in, much easier to make junk food. This revolution included restaurants, and the landscape of dining was changed with the rise of fast foods. It started with White Castle in the 1920s and built upon by McDonald's in the 1940s. And by the 1950s, the popularity of fast food was growing quickly. You can actually see back in the 1920s, when we've got Crisco and we've got all this and we've got some of the restaurants. Remember what I said earlier about how Crisco, how Procter & Gamble started moving all this sort of stuff into the restaurants, into the nutritionists, into basically the home economists and all these popular magazines and all that. And they started sort of moving it, but still at that time, there was still a lot of traditional food making and a lot of traditional restaurants. So, but, White Castle was one of the earliest sort of fast food, or that first type of, the new breed of fast food restaurants that were emerging, and it was only, and slowly they started trickling and growing. There were a number of other brands and some of them died off and some of them were consolidated or bought out or whatever, until we come to the big giants, the emergence of the big giants like McDonald's in the 1940s. So right in the actual war years and all that, and sort of these sort of companies started, promoting to the GI Joes, to the troops and all that, these sort of the fast foods, quick, the sort of music at the time, a lot of that sort of culture was starting to be intermingled with the sort of fast food industry. A lot of the actual diners that actually were providing things like sweetened beverages of sort of milk beverages, like milkshakes and stuff like that. These sort of things started emerging. So you had all this sort of industry in the 40s, in particular after the Second World War. And as we move through that decade into the mid 50s, it really starts picking up pace at that stage. And this is why by the mid 50s, we have this explosion in cardiovascular disease, 500,000, from 3,000 in 1930 to, 2.5 decades later to 500,000. Massive explosion in cardiovascular disease out of nowhere. But it's not surprising, because we're seeing that the food supply is being completely and utterly bastardized by, poisoned by seed oils, by refined sugars, and then this all coming together with the fast food industry and actually put on steroids at this stage. Compared to the past, the 1950s and late 40s and 1950s were basically fast food, on steroids. The growth of fast food industries were massive. I mean, you just have to take a look at the sort of companies that actually emerged. Dunkin' Donuts, 1950, in Quincy, Massachusetts. Church Fried Chicken, 1952, San Antonio, Texas. KFC, 1952, Salt Lake City, Utah. First franchise opened in that location. Kenny's, as Denny's now Donuts, 1953. Lakewood, California. Burger King as Instra Burger King, which is the old name. So, and 1953, Jacksonville, Florida. Sonic Drive-In, 1953. Shawnee, Oklahoma. And Taco Bell as Bell Drive-In at the time, 1954, San Bernardino, California, and then Pizza Hut, yes, 1958, Wichita, Kansas. So all these industries emerged in the 1950s, either in the early 1950s or in the mid 1950s. So these were the product of all those previous years, those decades, the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. Those three previous decades were the building up to this, where you had the seed oils, you had the refined sugars, you had a number of the new processed manufacturing methods and all that could allow these sort of franchises to exist, because up until then it was just too costly to put these things together, but by that stage, new equipment, new machinery, because remember, after the Second World War, a lot of the industries turned to consumer goods, and a lot of these started producing, machines for milkshakes and all sorts of things started coming out. So it was part of that period where we saw this sort of innovation in technology, in food technology. So that's what happened, to our detriment, obviously, but that's what happened through that period. Anyway, entrepreneurs of the decade learned that people enjoyed quick service, affordability, and consistency. And these are the hallmarks of the fast food industry. It's basically quick service, affordability, and consistency. That means whichever franchise, wherever you go in the country or even overseas now, you will find the same consistency, similar service, and a certain level of affordability within the price purchasing power of each country. So that's the sort of consistent thing that the fast food industry that's why it's called fast food. It's quick, consistent, and within an affordable price range for people to purchase. And that's why, to make it cheaper and cheaper, the easiest things to put in, as we notice, is just to put in more refined stuff. Because oils and refined sugar is cheap. With the current manufacturing methods that we've got, you know, high fructose corn syrup or whatever, it's dirt cheap, especially with high fructose corn syrup, because it's subsidized as well. So it's even cheaper than raw sugar. You know, that's how, you know, that's why it's used everywhere now, especially in countries where there's high subsidies like the US. But that's what's actually happened to, and that was the period when we saw that explosion. Now, when that explosion happened in fast food industry and refined sugars and all that, and we saw this increase in cardiovascular disease, a lot of people basically, you know, at the time, there was, you know, what is it causing it and all that sort of stuff. So you can understand how very easily you can point the finger at anything at that time, because, you know, the craziness is that by that stage, there had been already 2.5 decades, nearly 3 decades that had passed. Because if you're looking at the, you know, 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, you've got 4 decades. So that's one generation. So most people don't remember what the previous generation lived through unless you've talked to your father and whatever. And most parents, you know, they'll give you some rudimentary, they'll never go into any detail about how their lives were unless you really probe them, because you've got a reason to. Majority of people are just too damn lazy or just too uninterested. The more we live in it, we live in the presence. You know, humans live in the present time. We don't really reflect. And because we don't reflect, we don't ask the questions. And so we think the way we live today, or what we've got access to, or what's around us is what's around, you know, like it's been for a long time, or that's it, you know, that is part of the sort of the life, so to speak, of our culture, which isn't the reality. It's not at all, as we know, you know, but a lot of people out there, you know, the majority of the general public, that's what they're convinced, you know. We've always, you know, eaten like this and all that. And so it's very easy to manipulate people like that don't have a historical perspective of food. So they go, well, you know, back in the 1950s, a whole lot of takeaways and stuff like that. And, you know, and people, and there were, you know, there was, we know that, we will say that, but most people will say, well, because if you go back, if you ask most people what existed in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, they will tell you pretty much that people were eating shitloads of animal foods and stuff like that. That's what they'll tell you. But they got no idea about this sort of industry that really grew in that period. They knew it. They knew from movies and all that there was a bit of that, but they didn't really know that it really grew big and how it actually grew in the war years and how the troops were fed this sort of stuff because it was cheap, you know. So people got used to this sort of using these sort of things much earlier. But still, at the time, it was sort of 50% junk, 50% traditional foods, traditional animal foods, dairy, meats, and stuff like that was still, you know. So it was a halfway house. So you had half good foods, half poison at that time. It was very easy to basically condemn the good foods and make out the others at a later stage, because most people go back and say, well, you know, people back then ate, you know, meats and dairies and shitloads of animal foods, and they were still getting heart attacks. That's what people will say, because they don't realize by that stage, the food supply had already been highly polluted and highly refined in a number of ways. And so, you know, that's why we saw this dramatic rise, as I've said, from 3,000 or from next to nothing to 3,000. And then later on, as the fast food industry of the 50s and 40s sort of took off, pretty much the rest is history, as we know. So fast food delivered this was perfect for adults, teens, and children. That's their view. It could also be easily replicated, franchised, spread the successful local restaurant model across the country. Many of our largest and most popular fast food chains got their start during the 1950s. And that's the thing, even in the 1950s, still cardiovascular disease was, 500,000 was a lot of people compared to the past, but still compared to the numbers now, and the percentages in the population, it's massive in comparison. But it was easy to vilify animal foods and to make out, this sort of nonsense, because we had the Great Depression, where a lot of people, didn't get a lot of animal foods in because they were poor, because they were undernourished. When you're undernourished, to some extent, you're basically like semi-fasting or whatever. That's health. And so it's the same thing that happened, when they looked at populations after the Second World War that were based on starvation diets. And so from there, they extrapolated, oh, that's what people were eating in the past. And then we basically, we 50s and all that, we became wealthy. We started eating a lot of animal products and stuff like that. But they ignore that we were eating far more animal products in the past. Then it dipped because of First World War, Second World War, the Great Depression, those sort of years that forced this sort of dipping in animal foods and loss of a lot of new, cheap nutrition, good nutrition. And then by the 1950s, the food supply got diluted in that way with the fast food industry and all that. But at the same time, people were wealthier. 50s, 60s, people were much wealthier. And so they could afford animal foods. They could afford more of these sort of things. And that was probably the only good thing that was sort of minimizing the amount of harm in the population compared to what happens today, where it's just all shit, processed crap. So that's the sort of thing that, these people sort of ignore, and, their narrative is focused on basically using, oh, look at the 1950s, they were eating animal foods then, and, they were having cardiovascular disease. And so what are you guys making a big point that it's these things, So they very easily can argue that point because they used, that limited time, and they ignore sort of the fast food industry growth, the seed oils, all that sort of stuff that actually came in and polluted the food supply. They ignore the earlier times when there was shitloads of animal product consumption, butter and lard and swine, galore, and seafood. America then consumed, compared to today, 3 times to 4 times the amount of seafood that we do today. And if you look at the old cookbooks, as I've shown you, remember the one that I posted last time on one of my live streams, there's a link, I can't remember which one it is, but a number of people, Shell and a few others of you guys, have actually used it, and you really enjoyed some of the old recipes, and they're all, heavily animal based. But this knowledge has been lost, unfortunately, and most people use the excuse, oh, look at the 50s, look at the 60s, there were plenty of animal foods used there. People getting cardiovascular disease. It's not, it's not basically the sugars, it's not the oils, that's how they dilute the message. That's how they confuse people. They use this sort of narrative to confuse people. It's like all the epidemiological studies. Why do they do them? They do them because it's confusing. One day this is good, one day it's not good. That's a game. Whether one food or another food is good or bad isn't the actual question here that we should be asking. We should be asking, why are these studies being promoted by the food industry? It's actually to see confusion. Confusion is the best way, the best weapon, because as long as you can create misdirects, as long as you can basically say, well, we don't know, it's probably genetics, it's probably this, it's probably that, or whatever, and create as much maximum confusion, and you've got people guessing, and then you've got the mass media say, oh, this new study says this new study says eggs are good, or eggs are bad, or this is good, or this is bad. This constant confusion, people don't know. They go, oh, fuck it, I'll just eat whatever I like. And that's what happens, So, and then they say, well, you can get this cheaper kibble. That's what they'll be promoting in the future. And, it's good for the environment. It's good for this, and, works on the wokeness and all this sort of stuff. And what happens is people will do that, even if they don't go, I'm not saying that most people are going to go 100% plant-based. No. Like in the 1930s, they incorporated some of these sort of things in, and then in the 1950s, they incorporated some junk food and some good food. People even today will incorporate some good things and a lot of bad things, but they're just consuming even more bad things compared to today. That means where they may have consumed meat two or three, twice a week, they'll probably consume once a week, and they'll actually have even more fake shit, and they'll feel good about themselves. This is what, so it will be a slower erosion, but it will happen, and I mean, even now, there are politicians out there, certain people out there in the industry trying to promote the idea, oh, we should limit the amount of animal foods that people eat, and they should be restricted to, trying to put quotas and certain amount of consumption barriers and stuff like that, and how much, I mean, potentially, like we had with the coronavirus in recent times, where, supermarkets were restricting how many certain items you could purchase. If they pass legislation, that you can only purchase so many, you're in a really quandary, that, you're in a lot of difficulty. We have to fight back on these sort of things, because we've seen the disaster of the processed food industry and the kibble culture, where it's taken us, compared to the past, where robustness. Now you go around, you look around the cities, you've got all these fat people, you've got all these people that are half crippled, they can't even get around. You're seeing young people with walking sticks, or older people with frames. I mean, the population is getting sicker and sicker constantly. This is just not normal. But we act as if it is, because we've got no historical knowledge. We can't connect back to the past, when older people in their older years were robust and could actually work the land. People can't do that now in their mid years, let alone in their old years. It's really frightening where we're heading. And it's a sort of, these elites will be able to control us and sort of stockade us in, and feed us their kibble and their drugs to basically make us dependent completely on them. So and it's working, and a lot of people are voluntarily going along with the plan. It's awful what is happening, and it's scary what the future holds. You need to share this. You need to get it. You need to get this information around to your friends and family. They need to realize how dangerous following these new edicts, because that's what they are, edicts from above. We're told we should do this. It's good for the planet. It's good for this and good for that, and all that. It will be holy and good and worthy, citizens and stuff like that. We need to basically expose this bullshit, because it's so dangerous and so harmful to humanity. If we continue on this path, it's going to be a lot of suffering, and a lot of people are not going to survive it. There's going to be a lot of harm before people wake up to themselves. People sometimes have to get really sick, really bad, and even then, they will jump onto the drugs and kibble and hope for the best. So it's not looking good, guys, and we need to push back. We need to get the message out. We need to try and actually, Sean Baker recently, Bart's been doing it for some time. I've been trying to get the message out, many others. We need to sort of get the message out that how dangerous these developments are for humanity and for the rest of us. You know, it's not a good future. This dystopia that's unfolding is really, you know, worrying and quite frightening. And I really feel for the future generations. It's horrifying, you know, where we're heading. Look, I hope this. I don't want to. I'm an optimist by heart, and I hope that people wake up before it's too late. Anyway, see you guys.